Okay, hi Geraldine. So we're here today with Geraldine Comiskey, who regular viewers and listeners and readers might know from her work and our conversations in the past on Sophie Toscan du Plantier's murder in 1996 in West Cork. But Geraldine is a really, a professional journalist, a really well-known journalist in Ireland, and has spent a lot of time looking at that case and also the case that we're going to be talking about today as well. Let's talk about his prison time, and let's talk about the kind of implications for Ireland and the society of the time as well. So in prison, he was actually, this was a young offenders institution. It was, it's got a name, St. Patrick's Institution. It's the design of it apparently was based on Pentonville in London. So it's quite a similar sort of standard prison design, if you like, if anybody wants to try and imagine that who's not been to Ireland. But he did some weird things straight away. He was still into this satanic stuff. He painted a pentagram on the ground of the cell, on the wooden floorboards, and matching one on the ceiling. And this was described as artistic by people who saw it. So it wasn't like he just quickly did it. It was very precise, very nicely done. I can't even imagine why they would have let him do that.
Yeah, he did it with great care. I think that, David Malone, the author, can suggest that they thought it would be more trouble to actually challenge him on this. And it would cause more problems if they challenged him on it. It would be more disruptive, and he would be disrupting the other prisoners and everything because there'd be this big row over it. So, the other boys were terrified of him anyway. The other prisoners were. They were you could be locked up for shoplifting and everything. A child could be locked up for what will be considered minor crimes now. But so they weren't kind of they had this satanic murderer among them. They were all terrified of him. So the prison officers also may have been wary of him, because a priest got in once to visit him. Some prison officer let him in, and he looked through the hole into the portal into his cell, and he immediately shrank back, and he went out in white face, saying, "I've just seen the face of evil." I can't imagine some priests being like that, but most of the people just gave him a wide berth. He had a row with another boy once, and even though, despite being quite small and slightly built at the time, he hurt the other boy, or he intimidated him, and the boy was terrified of him. And it was most of the look in his eyes that used to terrify people.
That's a striking detail, isn't it? That he was intimidating without being big or heavy or large in any way. He was sort of psychologically intimidating, and you've mentioned a few times this look in his eyes. Yeah. So he went to this young offenders institution in October 1973, or that might have been while he was on remand. But anyway, he's locked away. Another interesting detail is that his parents didn't visit him for a whole year. We can imagine why his father perhaps might have had reasons to delay that. But people often say, that it's mentioned in this book that, murderers' mothers come and see them. His mother didn't put any pressure on, and she didn't. They came together to see him after about a year or so. Yeah. It just feels like a really cold household and a cold kind of setup there.
The thing about women as well at that time. She would have been. It was actually, Ireland was a bit behind, I think, because at the time women in England were mostly working. Mothers in Ireland were housewives. Even in the 80s, even when I was growing up, my mother was a housewife. It was quite normal. And if you worked in the civil service, you actually had to leave. So the mothers were very dependent on their husbands, and they would do whatever their husband wanted, and whatever the husband said was kind of gospel in the house. So she would have just gone along with it. And her husband, obviously a very devout man, was absolutely horrified. Not just, the idea that a son of his could do this, and maybe they felt that they wanted to protect the other children and just get on with their lives and not be seen to be visiting them. But they did bring him out for meals. After the year passed, after they reestablished contact with him, they brought him out to a hotel for a meal, and along with one of the prison officers who went with him. And it was on, as the author said, that was unusual at the time to go out for a meal in a restaurant in a hotel. It was quite a posh thing to do. So they obviously, being Christians, I suppose, maybe they forgave him, or they accepted that it wasn't the child they knew. He'd just been briefly corrupted. I don't know, because they didn't talk. They didn't want to talk about it, understandably, and he's very close to his family, according to himself. When he spoke to the author, he said his family and him were very close, and they stayed in touch. He was with his brothers and sisters.
It's almost like two extremes, actually. So first of all, they don't see him for a whole year, which is surprising. And then, incredibly, they get permission to take him out every 2 months on a Sunday evening for this meal in the hotel that you mentioned. Yeah.
Well, I
which,
can
yeah,
see
when I
that
was,
happening though. Yeah, I can understand that. In fact, that is more normal, I think, than if they just kept low level contact. This thing of rejecting him and then suddenly embracing him like the prodigal son, that's more common in a very devout family, I think, to do that.
okay. That is interesting. There's a whole load of things here. So I think we're getting more towards the sort of aftermath now. And so he's in prison. We know that he's released after just 7 years. It seems like a very short sentence, especially when you think that, I mean, these days, the Bulger killing, the Jamie Bulger killing that we talked about in the first half of this, those boys had their identities changed. They did a very much longer time in prison, as I remember. Then their names and identities were completely changed, and they were protected effectively, and they were helped to have. Well, the intention was that they would have a more normal life, but they were very much completely given a new identity.
Yeah, but they
Lorcan
were
Bale was.
Yeah, they were followed by the press and by people.
Yeah, the press.
But I do think, this is another thing. I was talking to a former prison officer about a year ago, or more than a year ago, and we were talking about Anna Creagle, the other girl who was killed in 2018 out in Lucan, not far from Lorcan Bale's house. And these boys were aged 13 and she was 14, and it was actually more shocking in a way than Lorcan Bale's thing, because they really brutally tortured her. I mean, one boy watched the other boy raped and did unspeakable things to her, cruel things. So the thing is that they should have been named. I think, because they were named by some people who were prosecuted for naming them. So it's against the law to name them. They were actually held in contempt of court for revealing the names. But I still think that people have a right to know, because if this person moves in next door to you and they did something terrible. I mean, even if they are a child, even if they have served their time, they should be given protection once they serve their time. They shouldn't be hounded and harassed. In fact, they're probably safer. It's safer to have everyone knowing who they are than to have them turning up in the community, somebody suddenly outing them, and then there's a vigilante mob outside the door. So I think it would be better if everyone did know who they were and they got the appropriate protection and the chance to turn their lives around. But this idea of because they're a child that they should have their identity hidden and then they're living under a shadow, and it must mess with their heads as well. I mean, if they do want to reform and they have remorse, I mean, this must really mess with their heads that they can't even speak about what they did to people they know.
Yeah, and I think this is perhaps, I wouldn't say it's more shocking, but it is very surprising that Lorcan Bale was released. You say that there were instances of him sort of being seen enjoying himself and so on, which you would imagine. I mean, we've got to say, in a legal sense, right? He's been found guilty. He's admitted his guilt. He's done his prison sentence, and he's now a free agent, right? That's it.
Yeah.
However, certainly these days, we tend to think that there's certain types of crime where the probability is that they will do it again, and therefore there's things like the sex offenders register, and there's checks and balances to try and keep track of these.
In fairness, he hasn't done anything since then. He's kept his nose clean forever. Like, ever since he got out of prison, he's been a model citizen by all accounts.
Yeah, and he's now, we believe, probably around 70 or so. So he's completely led a normal life as far as we know. He never has done anything.
Credit to the prison service and his family and everyone around him that he has actually never done it again. He has apparently turned his life around. He's a devout Christian now as well.
Maybe that is something we should talk about, is the fact that maybe nowadays with do we have to say this word, with cancel culture and so on, I feel like people have very thin skins. I'm not saying that we should excuse child killing. It's quite an extreme situation to draw the parallels. But you make the good point that the prison service, whatever they did to him, whatever structure they gave him, and we can say, one blow to the head, who knows, maybe there's evidence that he didn't realize John Horgan was dead and he was checking for signs of life and so on. He may have only intended to stun this boy. Nevertheless, what happened afterwards was clearly not only premeditated, but particularly unpleasant.
Yeah.
But maybe he didn't try and kill him. It's not like you said, he's not been tortured or anything. He's been killed very quickly with one blow. Maybe that wasn't deliberate. Maybe it was just to hit him harder than he thought he had, those kind of things. He must have felt guilt. We know he exhibited guilt on an evening when they were doing the search. And after that, he's adjusted his behavior and become relatively normal. There's certainly no mention in the book, I don't think, of any satanic behavior after he left prison. It was all, there's a few instances in the prison where he was using satanic and occult symbols.
Yeah.
But after that, he just seems to have led a perfectly, quite a religious life, but nevertheless a fairly normal life, quiet life.
But you know something as well, like the prison officers, by ignoring these pentagrams, you know the way child psychologists say when you want to stop bad behavior, also dog behavior experts say this, animal behavior, you ignore it. You don't. If you're rewarding it by noticing it. So maybe by just letting him do his pentagrams, just ignoring it and acting like, oh yeah, so that's just him, you know, leave him alone. Maybe they use that kind of. I mean, it would have been new at the time, that kind of psychology, but they did do it, and maybe it worked, you know.
Very interesting idea there. In other words, especially if you've got a rebellious child or a dog, as you say, a pet, if you shout at them and give a reaction, and they can see that they can get to you, would they be more likely to do it again? They're trying to annoy you. Actually, it's part of the antagonism of it. Yeah. That does make sense. Yeah. So the fact that they perhaps
as a teenager acting out, and then when they stopped, I do think maybe he didn't mean to kill the boy. Maybe the whole thing was just him acting out, and then it went too far. And I don't know. We don't really know, because Lorcan Bale refused to speak about it. He probably should speak to David Malone, because David Malone is actually David Malone sounds like he's a very open-minded and also being a very Christian journalist. You know, he probably should speak to some. I wouldn't recommend he speaks to tabloid people like me, maybe, but he should speak to someone, like David Malone, I think, and explain. He doesn't owe an explanation now. He's done his time, but I do think that there is. I just want to believe. I want to believe that he didn't mean to kill this boy. I just don't want to believe anyone could do that. Be so bad.
It would be easy for him to say that now. Would anybody believe him?
Yeah, I know.
I think, there's a lot of speculation. So even though we're used to dealing more with cold cases and unsolved cases, but even in a case like this, which is open and shut, it was solved on the day it happened. It's solved within 5 hours of it happening. There's still questions, right? There's still the why. We know the how and the what, but why? How? Why? How did it start to go wrong? And we've talked about that already. So maybe we should talk a bit about the book itself, because it is very even-handed. It's very dispassionate in many ways. And I can see I didn't take many notes for about half the book, because I was just so incredulous about the whole thing. And it's like a page turner, isn't it? But he's managed to avoid sensationalizing anything. He's not disclosed the whereabouts of Lorcan Bale, although he knew where that was. But one particular passage which was interesting to me about whether Lorcan Bale was a psychopath or a sociopath, because I've come across the Hare test before through John Ronson's work on the criminally insane or the psychopathic people. The Hare test is, and others like the DSM, there's various manuals and ways of diagnosing somebody who may or may not be a psychopath. And it clearly there's a detachment there, like you're saying, torturing animals and not being empathetic to their suffering. And there's elements there, but nobody's ever really suggested that he was a true psychopath, have they?
No, but I read a book, a famous book that the Hare test is actually, that he kind of drew on it by Cleckley. Now, Cleckley has been a bit discredited, but because he has some misogynistic stuff in it, he's got some stuff about gays and everything. So he has been, but it's an old-fashioned psychology book, and it used to be kind of every psychology student used to read it. But one of the things was he said about the lack of empathy part. I think it was him who said that they're moral imbeciles, basically, or he said something to that effect. Somebody read that, said it. Somebody, based on what he said, they are moral imbeciles, and they don't understand empathy. Like, there's a piece actually missing from their brain. And Cleckley gave loads of examples of psychopaths acting very irrationally and recklessly and taking terrible risks. They're risk takers, Whereas, a sociopath is a bit different. A sociopath is more cunning, and they cover the tracks more. They're just people who choose to be evil. I think sociopaths are more evil than psychopaths, based on what I understand. Some people think they're interchangeable, but I did a very basic psychology course, so I'm not an expert, but I started delving into it more then. And I think that a psychopath, a psychopath would be less intelligent. They could appear to be intelligent, academically or whatever, but but they're missing this part, this part that makes us all, this spark that gives us empathy that even higher class of animals have. So that they are kind of defective, psychopaths are, whereas sociopaths are not. So sociopaths are more cunning. So I don't know if this very intelligent boy, was a psychopath. I would say that he went astray. And the other thing about the age of criminal responsibility, you know, the way it's 10 for rape or murder in Ireland and at the moment, and it's 12 for other crimes. And they're trying to get it raised. I mean, a judge in the children's court told me once that this is wrong. It should be raised. Their minds aren't even formed. But some people say your mind isn't even formed until you're in your late 20s. You know, so I don't know. But I mean, where do you end? But I know in the Catholic religion, and I'm sure the Anglicans believe this too. This the age when you're confirmed, which is usually between the age of 10 and 13. I mean, most people are confirmed at 11 or 12. And that's when you decide, you actually say, you're asked by the priest, you're asked by a bishop actually, do you reject Satan and all his works and all his empty promises? And you have to say, I do. So you're actually you're confirming your baptism. So you are making an adult decision. So he would have been an adult in the eyes of the church. And he would have, because he would have been confirmed. He would have rejected Satan in front of everyone, the whole community and his family and his schoolmates. And then he would have chosen to actually embrace Satanism afterward.
So I did want to talk about that and how maybe he got some knowledge of satanic rituals and so on. We've talked, obviously there's no internet in those days. We've talked about just before this about maybe he found a book in the hospital library, which sounds possible, or maybe in a market or something like this. But interestingly, there was some passages in the book about the fact that really Satanism or satanic whatever is, I'm not going to say worship, but it's really set a system that opposes Catholicism. So in other words, it tends to be something which estranged or Catholics who have moved away from their religion, they sort of follow satanic practices as a rebellion almost. In other words, satanic worship isn't a religion on its own. It's an opposition to a real religion. And actually a lot of the satanic rules and regulations, or whatever you want to call them, practices, are Catholic ones. You know, they're the same, or they're obscure opposites.
Yeah, and I believe the Muslims believe this too. I mean, the Jewish people believe it. I mean, I think all the major world religions of the West and the Middle East believe this, you know. I mean, Satan is supposed to be Lucifer, the fallen angel, who basically gave the finger to God and believed that he could, you know. And this is why you know pagans who worship the earth. I mean, if you're a genuine pagan and you just worship the earth, that's one thing. But if you were a Christian and you become a pagan, you're basically doing that. You're following the example of Lucifer. You're kind of choosing that the earth is more important. This world is more important than the higher world. And you're rejecting your creator, and you're basically saying that people create themselves, that nature creates itself. That is actually satanic, and this is why there was so much controversy about the late Pope Francis when he had that ritual on the altar, when he invited some people who were converts to Catholicism that come from the Amazon. And I believe one or two of them walked out in horror and disgust because they said, we converted to Catholicism, and he does this. He had the Pachamama, who was an Amazon goddess or a South American goddess, and he had a ritual on the altar with a bowl of earth. So it was like earth worship, you know. And this was people. And a young man actually got a load of these Pachamama idols that were placed in churches around Rome. He took them, threw them into the river Tiber. I know I'm digressing a lot, but he threw them into the river Tiber. He was arrested by the Carabinieri, the Italian police, and they actually laughed about it. And they said that Pope wasn't going to press charges. But he was very serious about this, because what the Pope was doing was absolutely rejecting God by any, you know, it was an absolute sacrilege. And I happen to believe that what the Pope did was a terrible thing. Not the fact that it was a pagan thing. I mean, people believe that, but it was the fact that he was the Pope and he was doing it. So he was rejecting the Creator in favor of the creation. You know what I mean? So that was why the bowl of earth is important in Satanism, because it's kind of earth worship. But I mean, there's a bit in the book where it says he went to Newgrange and he apparently met some pagans, you know. And these, as the author points out, these could have been innocent hippie types, you know. They could have been genuine neo-Celtic pagans down, because I mean, an awful lot of them at the time Newgrange was open. It was left wide open. Anyone could go in there. I mean, I know people who went in there and slept there. They used to kind of they're Celtic pagans, and they used to sleep there at the solstice. Now it's all closed off and it's kind of only dignitaries are invited. But at the time, I don't think there was such a thing as a UNESCO World Heritage classification. So yeah, so he went there. He went there on the bus once. He was gone for a few days. He told his friend anyway, whether he did or not, whether he just stayed with a friend or not, I don't know. But he told his school friend that he did, and he came back and he said they had he had met Satanists there when he was at Newgrange.
So I've heard of Newgrange, ironically enough, through a Clannad song. And for people who don't know Newgrange, it feels or sounds a bit like Stonehenge to me.
Yeah, it's like Stonehenge, kind of, similar.
Yeah, and that was open in the 70s pretty much, and the 60s, and it's very much controlled now to protect the stones. So I'm getting the feeling or the vibe here that Lorcan's attraction to satanic rituals was seemingly a rebellion against his father and everything he represented. So it's kind of like it's not that he's going towards Satan, it's that he's just going away from whatever his dad represents. And the opposite of that, it seemed to him anyway, to be satanic or Satan itself. So, but that's really interesting that this whole thing feels like a rebellion against his father's way of life. They really obviously quite strongly didn't get on. His father obviously, either because of the times, wasn't as bothered by this detachment or this distance, or he was bothered and he couldn't somehow correct it or solve it or improve the situation. And then maybe he didn't mean to kill the boy, maybe this, maybe that. But when you first read the summary of this case or you hear about it, every single aspect seems absolutely unbelievable. And then you see actually it's a series of very small steps in a certain direction. So you mentioned, we'll try and wrap this up shortly, but you mentioned he gets in fights with his friends, which everybody does. I remember a lot of fights at our school. They were quite routine, but they were almost like a pantomime in a way. Nobody ever really got hurt. There was never any weapons. And it was just a lot of pushing and shoving. But he seems to have gone a bit beyond this. Then he started to torture animals. Again, any one of these things taken in isolation, that might have been the beginning and the end of the story. And then he has this thing in the loft in the attic. And then there's the spying on his own sister. And if you take everything together, you just get a very disturbing picture of a very unusual household. But actually, if you take Lorcan out of that situation, the family seems quite normal, really, apart from this very sort of overbearing strictness from the parents or from the father.
I mean, even the overbearing family strictness, I mean, that would have been normal at the time. I mean, I grew up in, I remember in the 80s, I mean, children were strictly kind of controlled, I mean, it was normal and for their own protection, apparently. I mean, it was well-meaning and all that, but I mean, you did your homework, you went to school, you came home, you didn't go out and hang around like you do now and all. Not many, not anyone I knew. And, I grew up in a similar neighborhood to Lorcan's, and, so I think that his family wouldn't have been unusual. They would have been just, apart from the Irish language bit, and the father was a bit of a holy Joe, as he called him, but there were lots of them around too. The most unusual thing about his family would have been the fact that the father insisted on them all speaking Irish. At the time, it would be more normal now, actually, that part. But I mean, apart from that, Lorcan stood out an awful lot in a family that was considered what would have been quite normal.
Yeah, it's quite the case, and I'm going to be reading more about it and looking more into it. Maybe I'll write an article about it later on when we've kind of digested things. So we'll wrap this up in a second, and I think it should just draw it to sort of draw up the loose ends and so on and conclude. I think that we're still, both of us, in this kind of, we're quite new to the case, and I think it's quite interesting that we agreed to talk about it now, because my normal way of looking at these cases would be to sort of become a mini expert in the case before having a chat with anybody about it, because then you can add to the debate and you can take all of the evidence and look at it from a distance, especially after 20 or 30 years, which most cold cases are that long ago. Whereas this time we've just finished the book. I'm still in that frame of mind of just shock, almost pretty much shock that this happened.
Yeah. And it's so shocking that we didn't know about it. Yeah.
We first of all that it happened, then that nobody knew, not just us, nobody knew about it except David Malone, who somehow found it by accident. And actually, it was his research that led to the inquest finally being held. So somehow they started an inquest, adjourned it until the criminal case had stopped and been resolved. But then when it was resolved, that was forgotten about, either because they wanted to brush it under the carpet or just because of some administrative issue. But the inquest happened because of this book.
Yeah, many years later, 2011. And the other thing is that the people in the area do remember it, but they kind of they think they imagined it. Some people have commented online. I was looking through the comments online, because I haven't met these people. They've said that they heard about it from other people and they weren't sure if it was true because it was so bizarre. Because they hadn't seen there was nothing in the papers about it. The way people say now, if you haven't got a photograph of something, what's the point of telling people because they won't believe you? Well, I mean, in those days, at least you would have seen something in the papers about it. But they didn't, and Joe Duffy, a famous broadcaster, he did a show about it and he was attacked for it, and people said, "What are you bringing all this up again?" But some people just said that they were unaware of it. They knew they'd heard of it and they hadn't believed it because they thought it was just a myth, an urban myth, a suburban myth. And we've had a few cases now that have been covered up in this country. A lot of child abuse. We had a lot of these houses of horrors where they're not the same, but where parents abused children and where babies were found and they were. Like babies buried. The Kerry babies is one. The House of Horrors in Jockey, another very affluent suburb, is another one. There's been the Roscommon, the Mayo House of Horrors. There's been loads of these houses of horrors, and we've only found out about those decades later. So maybe this would have been found out anyway because they all slipped under the radar as well. So maybe Ireland has loads of hidden horror stories.
Well, we tend to focus on Ireland because you've lived there, and you still live there, but. We have them too. I would say, certainly in my lifetime, England itself has been a less religious place, which in this particular case, could this have happened in England? Well, I think that the sort of strictness of the upbringing could have happened, yes. It's very unlikely that kind of religious element would have come into it. You could see how a child might do something to rebel against the parents very easily, but I don't think it would have had that depth of satanic religious overtones that this one has.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe there's one that we don't know about yet that's been covered up in England that we need to discover.
Well, another thing was the Hammer House of Horror movies. I think were kind of in their heyday at the time, and I'm just thinking, I wonder was the influence. I know they're kind of, when I look at them now, I actually look at them for fun. They're very and the Wicker Man and all these, they were actually funny, really. They're not scary. But when I was a child, and going right up into the 80s and all, and The Exorcist came out, those films, they were scary at the time, and now kind of even The Exorcist is still scary, I think, but I do think that he could have been influenced by movies, at the time. He could have gone to the cinema and seen something too. Maybe when he was in hospital, maybe they brought the kids to see a film or something. I don't know. He was there so long. But I don't really believe that he was influenced by anyone. He didn't have an older brother. What you were saying about someone you knew that their older brother basically was the one who introduced them to kind of awful horror stories. He didn't have anyone older in the family to corrupt them. He had just devout parents and younger brothers and sisters. He didn't seem to have mixed with the neighbours. The only friend he had was that other boy in school. He was a bit of a loner. So he would have had to have been corrupted either by somebody older than him or the books or a movie.
Indeed. So we'll draw it to a conclusion there. But the book we have been talking about today is The Boy in the Attic by David Malone. And I will share the links to that on the page as well, so people have it in the show notes. But all that remains is just to say thanks to Geraldine Comiskey for appearing today, talking in a different way. So normally we feel like we're quite well established in our research on topics, but this one we've both just been reading the last week or two. So thanks for doing that at short notice. And I definitely want to follow this up. I think there's more to be said about this case.